Good morning. My name is Hal Grodevant, and I'm the director of the Rudd Adoption Research Program, and I am so happy to welcome all of you here for our sixth conference, our sixth Rudd Adoption Research Program conference, New Worlds of Adoption. Very happy to welcome you here to the campus. For those of you who are new to the conference, I wanted to say just a little word about our program. The purpose of the Rudd Adoption Research Program is to conduct state-of-the-art research on the psychology of adoption that will impact policy at the agency, state, federal, and international levels. We train postdoctoral scholars, graduate students, and undergraduate students in the methods and theories necessary to study adoption. And through conferences such as this one, and workshops and publications, we disseminate research-based information that will be useful for people in the field and for those whose lives are touched by adoption. Through our key community partnerships, especially with Big Brothers Big Sisters of Hampshire County and the Re-envisioning Foster Care initiative, we demonstrate how adoption research can transform policy and practice for the benefit of those whose lives are touched by adoption. In planning for this year's conference, we sought to address a high-profile issue that affects a growing number of adoptions, and that is how best to help adoptive families overcome the early adversities that their children might have experienced prior to adoption. This topic reflects our continuing attention to the intersection of neuroscience, adoption, and builds upon earlier conferences which have featured well-known developmental neuroscientists Mary Dozier and Megan Gunner. Before we move into our first session, I'd like to make just a few acknowledgments, and first of all to thank our sponsors for this conference. Special thanks first of all to Boston College Graduate School of Social Work through my colleague Ruth McCroy. Where's Ruth over here? All right. Oh, it looks like we have a whole table from Boston College. That's great. So I want to thank Boston College for being a continuing sponsor of this conference, to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts Department of Children and Families, who've generously provided sponsorship and made it possible for many of their staff to attend the conference today, to the Massachusetts Psychological Association, who's issuing continuing education credits for psychologists, and here on campus to the Rudd Adoption Research Program, the Center for Research on Families, the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences. We have a new name. Department of Psychology has just become the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences in recognition of understanding the importance and acknowledging the importance of the integration of neuroscience and psychology. The Center for Neuroendocrine Studies, the Neuroscience and Behavior Program, the College of Education, and the College of Natural Sciences. So if we could give a round of applause to our sponsors, I'd appreciate it. And it's also my privilege to acknowledge Andrew and Virginia Rudd, who are here with us today, whose vision and generosity and commitment to adoption have made our work possible. Without their donation, which began the Rudd Chair in Psychology, we would not be here in this venue today. And for those of you who were here last year, you know that the Rudds have also established another center at Andrew's alma mater, the University of Sussex in the UK. And I just returned a couple of days ago from the launch of their center and making connections with their director, Professor Gordon Harold. And I'm really looking forward to identifying ways in which our two centers can work collaboratively and kind of create more synergy so that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts of our two centers. So I'd like to acknowledge the Rudds, if you would stand for just a second, and thank you for your generosity. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our Chancellor, who will be welcoming you to our campus, Chancellor Dr. Kumbal Subbaswamy. Chancellor Subbaswamy, a physicist by training, moved to UMass Amherst just 2 years ago to become the leader of our flagship campus. Prior to coming to UMass, he served as the Dean of Arts and Sciences, first at the University of Miami and then at the Indiana University, and then followed by serving as provost at the University of Kentucky. In his administrative roles, he's been especially known for success in fostering interdisciplinary research and training, internationalization, diversity and inclusion, and fundraising. He's currently leading our campus through a comprehensive strategic planning process, including revision of the budget process so that things are more transparent and accountable. We on the faculty have been very inspired by his vision and energy and his genuine interest in what we're doing. And we're grateful for the experienced leadership as he moves the UMass Amherst campus forward. So please join me in welcoming Chancellor Subaswamy.
Thanks very much, Hal. I must say that I looked on the screen, I looked at the April, I looked at the 14th, and I said, have I filed my taxes? And then I saw the 11th, and I was relieved. So, on behalf of the University of Massachusetts Amherst, welcome to the 6th New Worlds of Adoption Conference, made possible through the activities of the Rudd Family Foundation Chair in Psychology. The Rudd Chair, as you have heard, was established in 2005 through the generosity and support of Andrew and Virginia Rudd, adoptive parents whose daughter was an undergraduate in our psychology department. The Rudds took their efforts one step farther and made a commitment to connect the knowledge generated by the research efforts of this endowed chair with those practitioners who are working with people whose lives are touched by adoption. They also vowed to connect the knowledge with policymakers who are instrumental in making important decisions related to the adoption process, both in this country and around the world now. I would like, again, to thank Virginia and Andrew for their generosity and vision. Thank you. In 2008, Hal Grotewohl came to UMass Amherst as the Rudd Family Foundation Chair in Psychology. Over the past 6 years, under the leadership of Professor Grotewohl, the program has flourished and accomplished a great deal. I'd like to share some of the highlights with you. Of course, today you're participating in one of those successful efforts. By being here today and attending the 6th Annual Rudd Conference, each one of you has contributed in unique ways to greater understanding of adoption. We are also excited about the Adoption Mentoring Partnership, which is completing its 4th year of matching UMass undergraduate students who themselves were adopted with adopted children in the Amherst community. Research is being conducted to evaluate the impact of this program. The Rudd program is also partnering with the Treehouse Foundation, Friends of Children, and the Massachusetts Department of Children and Families in the re-envisioning of the foster care initiative. Professor Grotewohl created and regularly offers a popular senior seminar, The Psychology of Adoption, for UMass Amherst and the 5 college undergraduates. Through the Rudd program, mentoring is provided for graduate and undergraduate students who seek research experience on the topic of adoption. The Rudd program provides a home base for Dr. Rachel Farr, a research assistant professor leading the contemporary adoptive family study whose work concerns outcomes for children living in adoptive families headed by lesbian, gay, and heterosexual couples. The Rudd program is regarded as a valuable source of expertise in the local and statewide community. Professor Grotewohl was recently invited by Governor Deval Patrick to serve on the Governor's Task Force on Adoption. Could we take a moment to really show our appreciation to all that Dr. Grotewohl has brought to this community and to adoption studies? The Rudd program is clearly fulfilling the original vision set forth by Andrew and Virginia Rudd. And in fact, I asked them directly last evening and they agreed. All of the program's activities are aimed at connecting the best research with practice and policy to serve those whose lives are touched by adoption. As Chancellor of the flagship campus of the Commonwealth, it is my great pleasure to support a program that so directly uses research to improve the lives of people. So on behalf of the entire campus, I welcome you here today as we continue this important work. Thank you, and go UMass.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And now, without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for today, Dr. Philip Fisher. Dr. Fisher is professor of psychology, clinical psychology at the University of Oregon, and senior scientist at the Oregon Social Learning Center, and the Center for Research to Practice, all in Eugene, Oregon. He's also the science director for the National Forum on Early Childhood Policy and Programs, and a senior fellow at the Center on the Developing Child, both based at Harvard University. Phil's research focuses on childhood trauma and maltreatment, especially as they've been experienced by foster and adopted children. He's particularly interested in the effects of early stressful experience on children's neurobiological and psychological development, and is designing and evaluating prevention and treatment programs for improving the lives of these children in areas such as attachment to caregivers, relationships with peers, and functioning in school. He's been involved in the development of preventive intervention programs such as the multidimensional treatment foster care program for preschoolers and the Kids in Transition to School program. In connection with these therapeutic interventions, he's very interested in the brain's plasticity, so you'll hear some of that in his talk today. His work has been funded by several branches of the National Institutes of Health. He serves on many advisory boards at the national and international level, and his intervention programs are being implemented at sites throughout the United States and Europe. I've heard Phil speak a number of times, most recently last summer at the International Conference on Adoption Research in Bilbao, Spain. And every time I've heard him speak, it's like so clear. You know, Phil is able to take some really complex concepts and ideas, make it very clear for the audience, and help them see how it's going to be useful for them. And in fact, when I was talking with Phil about the concept for today's conference, he said a number of times, I want to make sure that people leave here with something they can take home with them and implement in their work setting, in their family setting, or whatever. So the idea is not just that by the end of the day everybody says, oh, that was a nice conference, and goes home, but that you actually have something that you thought through that applies to your work life, your home life, and the lives of people you know. When I heard him speak last summer at ICAR, I was just sitting there and I thought, he's the one. I've got to get him here for the conference this year, and so I'm so delighted that he was able to do this. And so for today, I'm pleased to welcome him and ask you to join me in welcoming him to talk about innovations and best practices helping adoptive families overcome early adversity.
Good morning. Great. Well, let me also acknowledge my gratitude both to the university, to Hal, for inviting me and organizing this conference, also to the RUDs for their generosity and support of this program. I do want to say, and maybe this is apparent to the people in this room, but if it isn't, I think it should make it clear that this is really a unique context, a unique conference, and really a unique opportunity that exists amongst the people who are participating. I think there are plenty of examples around the country and around the world where there are people in various disciplines, whether it's in academia or whether it's in providing services or just simply being part of the culture and community of adoptive children and families who are working or existing in isolation. But what this conference represents and what the program here at UMass represents is really an effort to break down some of the boundaries that have existed traditionally across those different areas. And that's really how change occurs. And I'll come back to that at the end of this talk. But I think all of you who are here are really, for me, bring a tremendous sense of optimism that the work that needs to be done that really does involve bridging all of these boundaries can be accomplished. And so thank you all as well for coming and for listening and for the work that you do. As Hal mentioned, I have a lot of connections and a lot of different entities within which my work is conducted. Several of them are in Oregon, in Eugene at the Oregon Social Learning Center and the University of Oregon, and as well, you'll be seeing a lot of material today from the Center on the Developing Child at Harvard University, which is really a national treasure in terms of the resources that have been developed and continue to be developed around understanding how early experiences shape the developing brain and why that's important for policy and programming. So I wanted to start by doing a little bit of contextualizing or framing of this talk in the sense that, as Hal mentioned, I'm going to be focusing a lot over the course of the kind of body of the talk on the challenges that many children who have experienced a lot of early adverse experiences have, and how we can facilitate positive development. But I think partially as an adoptive parent myself, as well as just being sensitive to kind of the landscape of adoption, that often when we focus on issues of adversity and challenges, that it sort of starts off painting a picture that's a negative one, and that's sort of fraught with all of the challenges. And so I really want to say, from my experience as an adoptive parent, and from the work that I've done, that really the larger context of adoption is one of the tremendous value and richness that it brings to the lives of everyone who's involved. And of course, there are challenges and struggles that we face along the way, and our work is oriented to trying to address some of those. But really, it's in the context of what's an incredibly rich and valuable set of experiences that anybody who's been touched by adoption, either personally or professionally, knows about. The other thing that I really want to frame my talk around is the idea that although the science is really giving us new information about what some of the biggest challenges are, that we are really, in terms of, as Hal mentioned, the neuroscience of this, and in terms of the development of effective programs, really on the brink of a point of tremendous opportunity and progress in this area. I think we have tools that we have never had before to understand what's going on and to address the issues that we see. And really, that presents an incredible opportunity for us to leverage. So I think as you hear the talk unfold, these will become clear to you as sort of central framing issues, but I just wanted to put them up front so you know about them. My talk's going to really focus on 4 interrelated themes, and you've already sort of gotten some sense of what some of those themes might be. But the first one is that the science that's developed and continues to be conducted around early brain development is really allowing us in ways that have never before been possible to understand the needs of adoptive children, and that science is also allowing us to be increasingly precise about which children are most likely to need ongoing kinds of support, and not only which children, but why those children are going to potentially need that support. So stay tuned for that. The second theme has to do with the idea that effective interventions already exist. They've been developed, they've been evaluated, they've been found to be effective, that can leverage our understanding of plasticity of the developing brain in early childhood all the way through adolescence and early adulthood. And that the programs that have been developed have evidence, at least some of them, that you can reverse or improve some of the effects that have been shown of early adversity on these particular systems. So I think that's tremendously promising. The third is really that beyond what's already been established, that really we are at a point where there are now many new opportunities that exist to really push things forward and rapidly accelerate the progress in this area of trying to figure out ways to support children following adverse early experiences. And I'll give some examples of those. And then finally, I think this is the kind of the no-brainer for this group, which is that if we're really going to make the most progress necessary, that we really have to have multi-level involvement and commitment across different contexts that include the research world, but also the political arena, as well as communities and families themselves. So before we begin with those themes, what I want to do is present you with 3 videos that were developed at the Harvard Center that tell kind of the core story of early development from the perspective of the developing brain and why the early years are so important for healthy brain development. So there's a little bit of technical fiddling I'll do while they're getting going. But basically, the first video in this series specifically talks about how early experiences shape the developing brain. And so off we go.
A child's experiences during the earliest years of life have a lasting impact on the architecture of the developing brain. Genes provide the basic blueprint, but experiences shape the process that determines whether a child's brain will provide a strong or weak foundation for all future learning, behavior, and health. During this important period of brain development, billions of brain cells called neurons send electrical signals to communicate with each other. These connections form circuits that become the basic foundation of brain architecture. Circuits and connections proliferate at a rapid pace and are reinforced through repeated use. Our experiences and environment dictate which circuits and connections get more use. Connections that are used more grow stronger and more permanent. Meanwhile, connections that are used less fade away through a normal process called pruning. Well-used circuits create lightning-fast pathways for neural signals to travel across regions of the brain. Simple circuits form first, providing a foundation for more complex circuits to build on later. Through this process, neurons form strong circuits and connections for emotions, motor skills, behavioral control, logic, language, and memory during the early critical period of development. With repeated use, these circuits become more efficient and connect to other areas of the brain more rapidly. While they originate in specific areas of the brain, the circuits are interconnected. You can't have one type of skill without the others to support it. Like building a house, everything is connected, and what comes first forms a foundation for all that comes later.
So really the basic message behind that may be already apparent to many of you is that in the early years of life, the brain is not fully developed when we're born, but continues to develop and is really shaped in terms of the circuits that exist by the experiences that we have. And so the circuits are created and become connected to each other based on the experiences that occur, and those experiences will vary for every individual. So what is it that most helps shape healthy brain development? Well, the group at Harvard, we've come up with the concept of serve and return as a naturally occurring process that occurs between children and their caregivers that's really instrumental in this process.
The key to forming strong brain architecture is what's known as serve and return interaction with adults. In this developmental game, new neural connections form in the brain as young children instinctively serve through babbling, facial expressions, and gestures. And adults return the serve, responding in a very directed, meaningful way. It starts very early in life, when a baby coos and the adult interacts and directs the baby's attention to a face or hand. This interaction forms the foundation of brain architecture upon which all future development will be built. It helps create neural connections between all the different areas of the brain, building the emotional and cognitive skills children need in life. For example, here's how it works for literacy and language skills. When the baby sees an object, the adult says its name. This makes connections in the baby's brain between particular sounds and their corresponding objects. Later, adults show young children that those objects and sounds can also be represented by marks on a page. With continued support from adults, children then learn how to decipher writing and eventually to write themselves. Each stage builds on what came before. Ensuring that children have adult caregivers who consistently engage in serve and return interaction, beginning in infancy, builds a foundation in the brain for all the learning, behavior, and health that follow.
Okay, so serve and return as the kind of core process that helps to facilitate healthy brain development. The last video focuses on kind of what happens in the absence of those kinds of processes and introduces the concept of toxic stress.
Learning to deal with stress is an important part of healthy development. When experiencing stress, the stress response system is activated. The body and brain go on alert. There's an adrenaline rush, increased heart rate, and an increase in stress hormone levels. When the stress is relieved after a short time, or a young child receives support from caring adults, the stress response winds down and the body quickly returns to normal. In severe situations, such as ongoing abuse and neglect, where there is no caring adult to act as a buffer against the stress response stays activated. Even when there is no apparent physical harm, the extended absence of response from adults can activate the stress response system. Constant activation of the stress response overloads developing systems, with serious, lifelong consequences for the child. This is known as toxic stress. Over time, this results in a stress response system set permanently on high alert. In the areas of the brain dedicated to learning and reasoning, the neural connections that comprise brain architecture are weaker and fewer in number. Science shows that the prolonged activation of stress hormones in early childhood can actually reduce neural connections in these important areas of the brain at just the time when they should be growing new ones. Toxic stress can be avoided if we ensure that the environments in which children grow and develop are nurturing, stable, and engaging.
Okay, so just to synopsize, experiences are critical, especially in the early years of life, in shaping brain architecture. Serve and return is an especially important process in the context of families in promoting healthy brain development and in the development of healthy neural circuitry. And in the absence of those kinds of healthy experiences, including serve and return, children can experience toxic stress, which can have long-lasting effects on the development of neural circuitry. So let's turn our attention now to the themes that I was saying I was going to focus on and talk specifically about how we can apply this knowledge to understanding which children in the context of adoption are most likely to need the most support and why. So the first group, and this will become apparent why in a minute, is children who've had the highest levels of neglect. I think this is really interesting and important. When we started our work with children in the foster care system, I think like many people, our assumption was that the majority of children were there due to physical and sexual abuse and other kinds of harm that had occurred. And we were really not that sensitized to the prevalence of neglect as a condition that leads children to be in foster care. Nor were we necessarily that sensitized to the potential negative effects. But it turns out that neglect, that is, the absence of kind of good things happening, can have as big effects as when bad things occur to children. One reason that this may be the case, and there is a lot of investigation of this particular area here at UMass, has to do with something called the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which is the system in the brain and body that's associated with the production of the hormone cortisol. Now, cortisol is sometimes referred to as the stress hormone. It is used sort of as a proxy of stress response. It's a hormone that really helps our body respond to demands in the environment that include stressful demands and helps us return to kind of more of a balanced state. It does that by doing things like increasing the metabolism of energy and heart rate and stimulating the immune system. One of the things that's characteristic of the system that produces cortisol is that it shows a circadian rhythm. And so if you measure cortisol levels across the day, levels peak at around 30 minutes after awakening and then drop off over the course of the day. So in an individual, you could see from this top graph, if this is the cortisol levels measured at 3 times during the day, they're going to be highest around the time of wake up and then drop off quickly by mid-morning, and then they'll be very, very low by bedtime. Now, when we started studying children, maltreated children, and other children who had difficult early experiences, the field was mostly focused on what happens under conditions of chronic stress in things like individuals who are depressed or who are experiencing a lot of illness. And that work had shown that rather than having decreasing cortisol levels throughout the day, that individuals just had high cortisol all the time. Well, that makes sense, right? You're under stress, your system that's supposed to help you cope with stress is activated, and so if you measure cortisol across the daytime, you'd expect to see high cortisol levels all the time. Does that make sense? At least a few nodding heads out there. Good. Okay. When we started studying maltreated children, what we found was something quite different, and it's this bottom pattern, where instead of having high cortisol levels throughout the day, cortisol levels were low when children woke up and stayed low throughout the day. Now, I was just getting into research on neuroendocrine function at that time. Fortunately, I had a very good set of collaborators, including Megan Gunner and Mary Dozier, both who've spoken at this conference in the past. And part of the question was, is this just an anomaly? Are we seeing something that doesn't really fit our understanding or not? And Megan, who knows everyone and everything, was tuned in very quickly to the fact that this was not just a pattern that was specific to children in foster care or maltreated children, but it was also one that was being seen increasingly in research done on children at that point who were living in conditions of severe deprivation in institutions in developing countries. In particular, some of the early Romanian orphanage studies showed the same pattern of orphanage-reared children, showed this low morning cortisol pattern. In addition, not only did we find this pattern prevalent among the children we were studying in Oregon, but Mary Dozier, with completely different samples in Delaware and Pennsylvania, was finding the same patterns, low morning cortisol that stayed low throughout the day. So begin to put the pieces together. I think as researchers, we don't just say, oh, we found something that looks different, let's make a big deal about this, because it could be an anomaly. But when you start to see it consistently, you begin to think, maybe there's some signal here, it's not just noise. In addition to what we saw in the human studies that were looking at children from these various adverse backgrounds in very different contexts, we also were working with Mar Sanchez, who studies cortisol levels in rhesus macaque monkeys. And she had two sets of studies that she'd done, one that involved rhesus macaques that were reared after being separated from their parents, so reared away from their parents, maternally separated monkeys, and a second sample of very interesting rhesus macaques that were reared by mothers who were maltreating, who were at some points neglectful, at some points a little bit more harsh in their parenting. Same pattern present in those animals as well. So we begin to put the pieces together, and this is really where neglect became sort of the predominant thing that we were looking at. It was the common experience across all of these different contexts. And so within the samples that we had access to, we went into case records. These were children who came from the foster care system and looked at their various experiences. And lo and behold, it was not physical abuse, it was not sexual abuse or other forms of bad things happening that were most strongly associated with the low morning cortisol pattern. It was neglect. So the children who showed the low morning cortisol pattern had high levels of neglect. Now, why might this be the case? Well, if you think about it in terms of this serve and return concept, children who come from very neglectful backgrounds really lack the experience of serve and return. And to the extent that responsive parenting, that having somebody to return your serve, when you're signaling, whether it's you're signaling distress or you're signaling interest, that can help buffer the child from a stressful early environment, then you'd think that in the absence of that, it's not all that implausible that we'd see effects on this particular system. And so that's sort of been our working model over time, that's what's happening, is that it's really the absence of a consistent and responsive caregiver that seems to be affecting the system and at least potentially causing it to downregulate, to sort of produce less cortisol over time because of the absence of that responsiveness in the environment. Okay, who else is at risk and why? Well, I think another population that's very important for us to consider is children who not only have had adverse experiences after they're born, but also who are exposed to prenatal stresses. We see in the foster care and in the adoptive population that children who may be adopted very early on, even at birth, still may struggle with some of the effects that we're talking about. And there you can't really look at necessarily serve and return as the key precipitating factor, but rather that what happens in the prenatal environment is also another set of experiences that help shape the developing brain. So we've looked at, and our colleague Barry Lester at Brown has also done a lot of work in this area, children who have both prenatal drug and alcohol exposure and who have been exposed to early adversity. And in this case, the children were slightly older, and rather than looking at their daytime cortisol patterns, what we did was to look at how they respond to stress when they come into the laboratory and have a stress task, a very mild stressor, but one that typically elevates cortisol levels. Typical kids and adults, when they come into the lab and have that kind of stress experience, show this pattern that you see on top where cortisol goes up, which is a way of helping maintain the body's balance. But there is a group of kids that we've studied in the context of these adverse early experiences that don't show that elevation, where their cortisol levels stay low across time. Barry Lester did some initial work and found specifically that children who were both prenatally exposed to cocaine and who had been exposed after birth to family violence were most likely to show the lack of response to that laboratory stressor. And we did a very similar thing with children in Oregon, where we looked at the same kinds of stress response, and it was children who had experienced both prenatal drug and alcohol exposure and abuse who really were more likely to show that blunted pattern in response to the laboratory stressor. So we now have a couple of sort of competing or reasonable candidates for things that we should be particularly looking out for in terms of things to pay attention to in determining who's likely to mostly need support. The third area that I think is really interesting is when children have to move a lot from one caregiver to another, which doesn't happen all the time in the context of adoption, but certainly does happen pretty endemically in the context of foster care, that seems to have pretty pervasive effects. And in particular, a lot of transitions seems to have a kind of negative effect on the development of a series of skills called executive functions. Can you raise your hand if you're familiar with that concept of executive functions? Excellent. See, this is a good example of science and practice and really becoming more integrated. So executive functioning includes a set of skills that really have to do with the ability to exert control, to be planful, to hold ideas in your mind, and be flexible in the context of kind of online, ongoing things. People sometimes refer to executive functioning as like the brain's air traffic controller. There have been a series of studies that have looked at the ability of children to perform executive functioning kinds of tasks based on the number of transitions they've had, and studies done in Oregon and again by Mary Dozier's group. So totally different groups of children find the more children move, the more likely they are to have difficulty on these tasks. And we also have done some interesting neuroimaging work where we've looked at brain activation as it relates to the number of times that children have moved. So this is a little audience participation part here, okay? So the task that we've tested children on is called the go, no, go task, and it works very simply. We have people sitting at a computer and they're holding a button. And we say there are a series of numbers that are going to come on the screen, and we want you to push the button every time a number comes on the screen, but not if it's the number 9, okay? So everybody get your button? Everybody have your button ready? Okay. So this is you sitting at the screen, and the idea is to not push the button. So you're supposed to show control over your impulse to push the button when the number 9 comes on the screen. Ready? Oop. Oop. Not so easy, right? Okay, so that's the way the task works. And what we do in that context is to look at electrical activity using EEG and ERP, which are little electrodes that assess the amount of electrical activity on the surface of the scalp that correspond to activity in underlying regions of the brain when people are performing this task. Or we do neuroimaging and look at the actual activation of the brain as we see from blood flow to specific regions. And what we found consistently is that individuals who've had these adverse experiences, when they're performing this task that requires them to not push the button, in those instances where they're supposed to not push the button, the areas of the brain that are supposed to help us do that, in the front kind of center and right around the middle of the brain, are not as active. And in order to accomplish the task, there's a lot more diffuse function. So your brain is kind of working a lot less efficiently in order to be able to accomplish this task. This is very similar to patterns that have been shown in children with ADHD as well. So there's sort of a nice kind of connection between what we see in early adversity and what we see in individuals who have attention deficit problems in terms of the way the brain has to work in order to be able to accomplish that don't push the button, which, by the way, is very hard. So if you found yourself pushing the button, it's okay. Okay. And the other thing I want to say is, so I've just given 3 examples, whether it's the absence of serve and return, whether it's prenatal exposure, whether it's moving around a lot, that seem to be indicative of the likelihood that children are going to need additional levels of support. But those are just models. And really the idea here is to take the neuroscience, take our ability to study particular underlying regions of the brain that are involved in critically important functions, and map experiences, specific kinds of experiences, not just generic, oh, you had some hard times, but the specific classes of experience that seem to have the biggest effect on those systems, and to have connections occur that exist for really reasonable ways. So the absence of serve and return impacting cortisol is a very plausible way of thinking about why we're seeing anomalous cortisol levels in these individuals. Once we've done that, we can then begin to create kind of models for thinking about how to make support available. Not that you don't get support if you're not in this category, but at least how we can think about the allocation of services and the availability of support for individuals depending on the kinds of experiences that they have. So we're not just saying, well, it's an open book, we'll see what happens, but we're really being much more planful about the likelihood that individuals are going to need that kind of support over the course of time based on what their experiences are. And to the extent that people have had very mild experiences in particular areas, maybe we're less concerned. But to the extent that they've had very extreme experiences in this area, then maybe we should be more tuned in and be ready to provide the support when needed, which as an adoptive parent, I can say that would have been helpful. Okay, so the next theme, so we turn from kind of mapping the effects of these experiences on underlying neural systems to thinking about how we can impact these systems through effective kinds of programs that already exist. Now, we've developed in Oregon a number of programs that are interrelated and that have a lot of similar qualities, and so I'm going to talk sort of more about those first and then talk about some of our new and more innovative approaches that we're getting to. But really at the core of our intervention models and where we're hoping to sort of move things past what has traditionally been the way that services have been allocated is that in the context of foster and adoptive care, the standard service delivery model has been, well, the home provides love and care and meets the basic needs of people, and that's where that good stuff happens. If there's a problem, then the child must need therapy or the family must need therapy. Those are kind of extra familial things. It's like a problem that has to be solved outside of the context of what's going on. And really, our belief is that by doing that, by sort of separating the family context and the therapeutic needs of the individual, that you're really setting yourself up, partially because so many of the issues that we know occur in these contexts happen in the basic relationships that exist there. So really our model is to view the family as the therapeutic milieu. The family is the place not where you're just providing for the basic needs, but really where the therapeutic experiences can happen. And it's in the context of the family that we have the greatest potential to impact outcomes. So there are a number of programs that have been developed at Oregon that sort of fit this model and this approach. Hal mentioned several of them. There are some other names. We're not very good at naming programs in Oregon. Can you tell? Kids keep. They're not very intuitive, but we're getting better. Anyway, the most relevant program to this conference is a program that's called Adopt, and it was developed specifically for the context of adoption in England. And the only reason that that's the case is that we've been working collaboratively with folks in England in the government for a number of years on foster care, and they asked us to develop a program to support adoptive families as well. So this program was adapted from a program that was originally designed in Oregon, and it's really designed to help provide the basic tools. So it's really kind of a prevention program when families are new to the adoption context, to help them join together with other families and to learn about some things that have potential to be useful for kind of their long-term success and support of their child. And this is a group context. The groups last for 90 minutes. It's facilitated. It's got a manual that's associated with it. And there's a lot of support for the group facilitators in terms of administering the approach in a very consistent way. I'm not going to read to you what all 16 sessions consist of, but you can see that there are things that would be presumably germane and relevant, especially to new adopters, things that have to do with facilitating kind of the child's functioning in the home, ways to support positive behavior as well as ways to deal with challenging behaviors when they come up. And there's a little bit on managing your own stress as well. This program is currently being developed and implemented in England at 9 sites around the country. There are not specific plans at present to implement this program in the US. We're certainly interested in that. I'm not saying that because I'm looking for opportunities here as much as that I do think that it's a needed area, that programs that are specific for supporting adoptive families are really not as ubiquitous as they need to be in this country, and they typically are more reactive as opposed to proactive. So I think that is an area that we really need to be focusing on as a group. So what about these programs? If we put these kinds of programs like I was just describing in place, can they mitigate the effects of early adversity? That's been one of our primary questions over time. And the answer is yes, they can. And I'm going to show you some really exciting data that support that conclusion. So this is our friend, the HPA axis again, that produces cortisol. And remember that what we found in many of the children that we were looking at, and I want to be clear, this is not all of the children. And again, it was more prevalent in kids with severe early neglect. But we found this blunted morning pattern. When these children were in these kinds of supportive family environments that where the families were getting the kind of support that I just described, one of the things that we saw was the emergence among these children of a typical daily pattern across time. So their morning cortisol levels that were low to begin with became much more typical over time, and we began to see that kind of average daily pattern that you'd expect to see. And that went hand in hand with a decrease in the amount of problem behavior that was being reported by the carers, the people who were taking care of the children, over the same period of time. So this nice concordance between the regulation of this underlying stress hormone system and the kind of regulation of the child's behavior in the context of the family. So those things can change kind of hand in hand. Okay, this is another computer task. This time you guys don't have to do it. I'm just going to show you how it was done. So we were also interested in executive functioning, as I've mentioned. And this is a task that actually was developed by Jen Martin McDermott and her graduate advisor, Nathan Fox, when she was at the University of Maryland. She's now here at UMass. This is called a flanker task. The original version was developed for adults, so Jen's work was to adapt it for children. The task involves the following. We tell people they're going to be looking at a computer screen, and a white dot is going to come on the screen right in the middle. And they have a button box that has a green or a red button. And after the white dot comes on, then a series of colored circles comes on, and they have to push the button that's the same color as the circle right here that's above the white dot. Okay, so in this case, pretty easy because everything's green. In this case, pretty easy because everything's red. It's much more difficult when what you have is a green circle in the middle, but it's surrounded by red circles because you have to screen out the red, and there's a predominance of red, right? So these flankers, the things that flank the middle circle, can make the task more challenging. And the other thing that you can see is that after the children made a response, we let them know whether they were getting the response correct or not. We had either a smiley face come on the screen or a frowny face came on the screen, and that let them know whether they'd done a good job or not. What we were interested in is the electrical activity, and remember I was talking about EEG and ERP, the electrical activity that we saw at various points on the scalp after the children made a response, and in particular after they made an incorrect response and got the feedback in the form of a frowny face that they'd made a mistake. So instead of you having to do this, we can call on my friend Andrew here. He's a friend of our family who's demonstrating the task for you. So you can see he has the electrode cap on here. He's looking at a computer screen. You see the colored circles coming on and the response that he's getting, whether he gets it right or wrong. So we have them do that for some period of time and a lot of responses, and then we look at the incorrect responses and the amount of electrical activity that we're seeing in response to the incorrect responses when there's feedback. Now, what we noticed was that in typical individuals, when they're doing this and they make a mistake, we see an increase in the amount of electrical activity in this area in the front of the brain when they make a mistake and they get the feedback that they've made that mistake. But in the context of kids who've had these adverse experiences, when they make a mistake and get feedback, we didn't see the same increase in electrical activity in that area in the brain. Now think about what that might mean in terms of children's ability to do well. And so this is one of the ways that you can map on kind of some of the brain stuff to some of the challenges that we see. So your child, you're in a classroom, you're doing things you're not supposed to do, the teacher's trying to cue you, you're supposed to raise your hand and not blurt answers out, but you're not picking up that corrective feedback. There's not any kind of increase in the particular area of the brain that's supposed to help you change direction and make plans when you're making that mistake or getting feedback. Or you're on the playground and you're playing with peers, and instead of like asking for a turn, you grab something and they start looking at you in an annoyed way. But you're not picking up on that. So the signal's not getting through. Now, a lot of our programs are based on, well, let's just give the child information, let's just tell them what they need to do more. But if the signal's not getting through, then the ability of the child to benefit from that kind of information is going to be really limited. So we need, in those contexts, to be much more thoughtful about how we deliver services and support to children who are like that in the context of interventions. But the good news is that when we do that, so for instance, in several of our programs, we've looked at what happens to kids who are receiving that kind of support over time. And what we found is, so this is sort of like the typical response to corrective feedback is an increase in electrical activity. And in kids who come from adverse backgrounds, we see very little increase in electrical activity after they make mistakes. But once kids who've had this pattern get into really responsive, kind of good serve and return environments, then when they make mistakes and get feedback, we see this response that looks much more like a typical response. Does that make sense? So we're really seeing the ability to reverse some of these effects if we put the right conditions in place. And I think that's a really important take-home message, that these effects, even though they map on to particular kinds of early experiences and they're detectable in terms of changes in the brain, they don't necessarily mean that they're permanent changes. There's a lot of plasticity in these systems, and the right circumstances, especially if we're precise and targeted enough, really have the potential to make breakthrough kinds of changes in not only the child's kind of way that they function in their daily environment, but also at the level of the brain. So don't let anybody tell you, once the brain's been shaped in a particular way, it's a done deal. We know that that's not the case. And of course, we would know that from things like people who have stroke or other head injury lose function and then are able to recover that function. The brain really has a lot of remarkable plasticity in it. Okay, so that's kind of like, that was until recently, sort of the story so far. But I have to say that as somebody who's sort of been very strongly involved in that work over time, and especially the research work, that I, in the context of being an adoptive parent, looking for services, have really felt quite impatient at times at the snail's pace, there's the snail, at which progress occurs. That is, I think a lot of what has happened in the field thus far has been very influential and impactful. We know that there are programs that work. We know that we can change specific regions of the brain. But the research takes a tremendous amount of time, and a lot of the models that we have are incredibly cumbersome for bringing about that change. So, sure, we can make a change, but a child has to be in a program for 12 months, and we have to have intensive services for everybody that's involved. And by the way, if you ask the developer of that program, well, what's really the most effective component of that program? We don't know. Because what we did was, when we were developing these programs, was to front load them with as much stuff as we could in many instances, because we wanted to maximize the chances of things being successful. Why do we do that? I mean, one of the reasons is because, you don't want to take the chance that something might not work. But it's also because the way that funding for research exists in this country comes in big chunks. So if you get a grant to evaluate a program, and it's a 5-year grant, are you really going to sort of do the minimum dosage possible in order to bring about change? Most people have not wanted to take that risk. They really ramp up the total amount of services so that they can detect that things will change. And there are some other things that I think have made me quite impatient in this area. For instance, we get very excited when we can say an intervention is effective, it's evidence-based. Well, that's great, and no doubt it's better than not knowing or doing something that has no effect. But the effects of many of these programs, including the ones that we've developed, are not always as large in magnitude as we would like. So they can be statistically significant, but that doesn't necessarily guarantee that they're clinically meaningful. And even if they're effective overall, we also know that there are many individuals for whom they're not having an impact. And our field has been very sluggish, another little, on there, in really thinking about how to be much more specific and prescribed in terms of the way we approach these things. So, if you think about medicine as a comparison, in medicine we don't say, well, we have these medicines that they work pretty well for most people, and that's as far as we get. We don't really know why they work or how they work. We've continued to push the envelope and look at people who don't respond and figure out new medications and figure out what the mechanisms of action are. And I think this is precisely the direction that our work needs to go in. And I know that can sound really ambitious, because it's been enough to just get evidence-based programs into place in community settings, that the idea that we've finally gotten there and that's not acceptable and these programs aren't really as great as we would like. I mean, I think it's important to really celebrate the change that's occurred in terms of these programs, but not to rest there, really to continue to push things. So this is sort of my next kind of generation of work that's been oriented to trying to develop programs that have potential to be much lighter in terms of their footprint, but impactful and also flexible in ways that allow them to really fit into the natural context of environments that they could occur in. And the program that I'm going to talk the most about is one called FIND. So like I said, we're getting a little better at naming our interventions. FIND stands for Filming Interactions to Nurture Development. And it's a video coaching approach. So the idea behind this is that we're really trying to kind of go beyond the standard and innovate. And this program is based on not one or two, but 3 innovative ideas that have really guided our work thus far. The first is about the concept of serve and return as being what we should orient a lot of our support services around. Serve and return is a naturally occurring phenomenon. All children serve. They serve all the time. Babies gurgle and babble and look at things and point, and as they get older, begin to vocalize what they're seeing. And adults, even under the most stressed out conditions, are motivated most of the time to return the child's serve. And so we have learned, and we've learned this by watching very closely what's going on in families, that it's possible to find many instances of serve and return that are occurring in naturally occurring contexts. Now, with children who come from adverse backgrounds, sometimes the serves sometimes they're very weak, and so if you're trying to be a good returner of a child's serve, sometimes children, you really have to watch carefully for it. Sometimes children from contexts that we know about they don't serve weakly, they serve to everybody, the indiscriminate friendliness phenomenon. So there are some issues around serve and return that are very specific to the context of adoption and to foster care. But nevertheless, it's possible to pick up on serve and return. And one of the things that's so important for us about this is that if we focus on the serve and return process, then we're not talking about something that the child is doing wrong or a skill that a parent might not have that we need to teach them. We're talking about looking at things that are naturally occurring in the caregiver-child relationship and showing them to people as they're happening as a way of building out from some naturally occurring things that we know are at the basis of healthy development. So in our model of FIND, what we've done is to take the serve and return process and break it down actually into component parts where we can find instances where the parent is just simply noticing the child serve. So sharing the child's focus, what they're looking at, as a way of noticing that the child is serving. And then a variety of ways supporting and encouraging the child or naming what the child is doing that are about returning the child's serve. Some subsequent kind of more superordinate aspects of the serve and return process. So once the child serves and the parent returns, then it goes back and forth for a while in some instances. It's not just a tennis game where the person serves really well and the point's over, but rather the game continues back and forth. And then in lots of naturally occurring interactions, there's a period of transition where one kind of serve and return process will stop and the other will begin. These are all things that you can see when you look at parents and children interacting. Our editing of films involves finding the specific instance, and these are very brief, you'll see some examples in a minute, of the serve and return process, or these elements of serve and return, and showing the entire clip as it goes by really quickly in a 5 or 10 second period, but then showing it a second time in a way that breaks it down into much more of a play-by-play or kind of starting and stopping of the activity as it's occurring, and then showing it again in its entirety. And each of our coaching sessions where we do this will show 3 clips in that manner. So you get to really see what's happening, that what's going on that you're doing and that the child is doing in very clear form, because you're not just seeing it and it runs by quickly, but you're seeing it as it's occurring, but in a much more kind of slowed down process. This is very different from a lot of other video coaching where what you're doing is just sort of watching long periods of time and kind of discussing what you're seeing. It's much more precise and specific. So let me give you a couple of examples. This is a clip that comes from the element called supporting and encouraging. So this is one way in which parents can return the child's serve, and what you'll see is the initial clip with a little description up front, and then you'll see it broken down bit by bit, and then you'll see the final clip in its entirety again. Okay, so the baby serves by vocalizing, and mom supports the baby by first asking, do you want to get up, and then picking him up.
You want to get up? Are you done? You want to get up? Okay. You want to get up? Let's do that. That's better, huh? Yeah. Already better.
Okay, so that was the first, you just saw it in its entirety. That's the whole thing. So that was the entire supporting and encouraging. And even though you see baby fussing and mom picks him up, that's kind of what you saw, but it went by pretty quickly. But let's look at it in individual kind of pieces. So the baby's lying on the couch, and then he starts to fuss, and we'll stop it there.
You want to get up?
And then we say, Mom, okay, now you returned your baby's serve by asking, do you want to get up? And then your baby continues to fuss.
Are you done? You want to get up?
And then mom asks, are you done? Do you want to get up?
Okay.
And then the baby looks at mom, and mom, you say, okay.
You want to get up?
And now your baby's kicking with excitement, and you reach down to pick up your baby, and you repeat, do you want to get up?
That's better, huh? Yeah. Already better.
And then you support the baby by picking him up, and you can see the baby's better, and mom asks, all right, are you all better?
You want to get up? Are you done? You want to get up? Okay. You want to get up? Let's do that. That's better, huh? Yeah. Already better.
Okay, so just a very basic kind of interaction, very sweet, but you have something that goes by in a flash, but you can see there were like 7 or 8 discrete chunks of baby does something, mom does something, And really, by slowing time down, you can see how much more there is going on in that. And if you want to know what you're doing right, and somebody says, oh, you see, you just did that, that was right, that would be challenging. But if you can really see it broken down like that, it seems to be very transformative in people's understanding of what's going on. So we'll look at two more. I won't narrate these. One is for this concept called naming, which is another way that parents can return their child's serve.
You open, close, open, you open, close, open, you open, close, open.
So again, really quick, but you can see how much is going on there with mom and baby, where she's naming what he's doing. So he's serving by doing stuff, and she's naming, and he's going to start learning the meaning of words by doing that. Okay, and the last one is an example of turn taking.
Mom? Yes? Please what? Do you need help? Okay. Can you help me? Oh, there we go. Mom? Yes? Please what? Do you need help? Okay.
Okay, so you can see, again, that there's a very brief thing, but there's a lot of stuff going on in terms of them going back and forth in that reciprocal
Yes.
turn-taking. Okay, so the third aspect of this that we designed specifically to kind of push things forward in terms of kind of moving past the more cumbersome process just has to do with the idea that a lot of the tools and technologies that we've developed can be very complicated to implement and require a lot of resources. But this is an approach, because it's video-based and because video is kind of becoming ubiquitous. It exists on our cell phones, it exists on laptops, it exists on tablet, that we're becoming increasingly able to do regardless of the context. It does not require a big investment. It doesn't require that people come into a center. All of this stuff can be done in remote ways. The editing can be done easily. The transmission of material can be done easily. So there's a lot of stuff that really works well that way. I'm going to zip ahead a little bit here.
Yeah.
I just want to show you quickly how the coaching session works, where we're not only where we've edited the film, but then we're going over the film and talking about it as it relates to serve and return.
In this last clip, Ruby served by coloring on her picture, and you return her serve by looking and encouraging. Good coloring, Rube. That looks great. And that's when you return. Good coloring. That looks great. And it's, you know, your facial expression, your tone of voice, and what you're saying are all just really encouraging to her.
So the reason I wanted to show this is that the coaching that goes on in this context is not in-depth, it's not interpretive, it doesn't require people to determine what might be going on at a deeper level. It's just descriptive. We're really describing for people the serve and return process as it's unfolding. And as a result, it's fairly straightforward for people to learn to use these kinds of edited films and coach effectively from
In this
them.
last clip,
No, I liked it. I really enjoyed it just because, like you said, they're taking things that you already do, and so I guess it just made me feel like, oh, I know how to do this, and they're taking examples of times that I'm already doing it. Yeah, so it just makes me pay attention more to those serves than to, like, okay, she's trying to tell me something, and yeah, she's old enough, even though she's a baby, she's old enough to actually have serves. I don't think I understood that concept with my first.
So this is just a parent commenting on what the process of learning about serve and return looks like and how effective it is at kind of a way of understanding her child's communication. So, I mean, beyond sort of these concepts around how these kinds of approaches can move things forward more readily because they're much lower dose, they have potential to be highly effective, they're built on people's strengths. There are some other aspects of these kinds of approaches, and I offer this not as the solution, but as an example of how we can kind of move beyond the more cumbersome models. First of all, approaches like this don't have to be taken as you do this instead of everything else, because this is just something that occurs in the context of any interaction that a support person might have with a family. They can either be standalone approaches or they can fit into existing other kinds of programs, support programs, home visitation programs, et cetera. They're also flexible in that this kind of coaching can work with moms, with dads, with other people who are taking care of children. So they really have the ability to be used widely. They can be used in individual contexts, they can be used in group settings, they can be used either in the context of just trying to make things go well or more intensive kinds of services. They also don't require a high level of resources because the editing of films can be done either by somebody who has a lot of expertise or can be done centrally and then sent out to people who are doing more in the field kind of coaching. And I think more importantly, these kinds of approaches, because they're tied, and I'm not going to get into it in the context of this talk, but they're tied to very specific understanding of the underlying neural systems and the processes that we're trying to affect, have potential to be very effective, but at a much lower dose, and really therefore allow us to be much more planful and able to apply them more broadly than a lot of the other support programs that have been out there. So I think they have potential to contribute and move things on in that way. Okay, so my final theme, which will just take me all of a couple of minutes, is just to point out that really the kind of progress that's necessary. So if we kind of take our focus back now from the brain and even from the individual child and family that might be in need of support, that really if we're going to make kind of breakthrough changes, we need to work effectively together. So I might, as a researcher, have particular knowledge that can be impactful in terms of changing the landscape and providing support, but I'm certainly not the one who's going to make the policy that's going to provide the resources to make that kind of a program available. And as an adoptive parent, I may recognize that the need for support is not something that needs to be available 24/7 from the moment I adopt my child forever, but that there are key points in my child's development during the initial transition period, at onset of adolescence, moving towards adulthood. All of those times are times when I think we need especially high levels of support. I can say that, but I can't design the programs that are going to be there at those times. And so it's really a question of the extent to which we're able to work together and break down the kind of boundaries that have existed amongst us historically in order to make these kinds of changes. And so my final slide and the image that I'll leave you with is the idea of breaking down silos in order to really make these breakthrough changes. That, if policy people and people who are in the legislature and people who have research experience and program experience and families themselves can work together, that's where these kind of breakthrough outcomes are most likely to occur. And it's kind of a nice place to leave things because we now have the remainder of the day as a group to be those people who are breaking down the silos. So we can all pretend that we're in the little operating thing here and smashing the silos as the day proceeds. So thank you. And I believe we have some time set aside now for question and answer or discussion. So this doesn't necessarily need to be that you're asking stuff of me, but if you also have things that you want to respond to that other people have said, feel free to do that as well.
And we'd like to ask people to come to the mics because we are filming the session today, so just raise your hand and we'll bring them.
I'm an adoptive parent. My name is Kat. We adopted our daughter through the Department of Children and Families, and she was adopted just at her second birthday, although she came to us when she was 8 months old. We have no history. We don't know what happened to her in those first 8 months, aside from very general information. So given that, we don't know.
Right.
And now we're facing some very serious issues with her, behavioral issues. We're not quite sure. We've been pursuing many different kinds of interventions with her, but as you said, the resources are very limited, and children's development is not unified, so kids develop in all these different aspects, in all these different ways, and something that we're running into with her is because she's so incredibly bright and incredibly physically adept that the behavioral issues and the emotional issues, some people are taking it very seriously, but a lot of programs that are out there are like, well, she doesn't qualify, she's fine, she's developing ahead of the curve intellectually, physically, therefore she doesn't qualify for Head Start, she doesn't qualify for some of these other programs. What do you suggest?
How old is she now?
She's turning 3 in June.
Yeah. I can certainly validate the fact that it's a challenging context to be in. One of the things I know as an adoptive parent myself, and certainly that I've heard far and wide, is that parents often feel like they're educating professionals about their child. And I think some of the things that you describe in terms of, in some ways, she may look like she's doing fine, and people will resonate to that first and foremost and say, oh, well, she's fine. Maybe, are you sure your expectations aren't too high, or something like that. And I mean, I think that the things that I can say are most productive in the larger context of what's available are, one, which sounds like it will be there, is your ongoing commitment to continuing to provide support for her and to find the services that fit, and not to let people say, no, she's fine, just let it be. And the other is to yourself be in a context where you have the support that you need to be able to do that. So, I mean, the specifics around what to do to move things along, most of the experiences that I've had suggest that the standard things that are effective can work, but they take longer, and they take more sustained effort, and they take kind of more consistency than people necessarily, whether it's parents or providers, are used to. And so having an idea that you're going to do these things over the long term, and they're going to require, more effort than might necessarily be expected by anybody, are really the most important things. But I would totally trust your instincts that what you're doing is the right thing, and that you need to keep pushing to get the support that you need. I wish I could say there's a program called X, then just do that and it'll make a difference. But it's really...
That's what I was going to say, who's going to fund
well,
that?
yeah, right. But I mean, I think part of what I'm saying is related to the concept of serve and return, that the things that you're describing can get serve and return totally out of whack. And so part of the question is, how do you maintain your ability to provide responsive returns that help to promote her healthy development in the context of what are some really challenging behaviors? So, yeah. Yes?
Kind of following up on that, do you have any data, or do you have a control group of children who are growing up in optimal environments but genetically are predisposed to have lower executive functioning, that their brains were designed differently from the start?
Right.
So how do we tease apart whether it is really that's the way her brain was originally designed and she's in a great environment, but maybe those resources she needs are not related to adoption? Specific issues, and so how do we tease apart to educate others to not, I always worry about hanging everything, I think you said at the very beginning, on this peg of adversity and adoption when we have lots of children who are struggling with those executive functioning issues, nonverbal learning disorders,
Right.
who are growing up in amazingly wonderful, rich
Absolutely.
environments.
Right.
And the services we provide to them obviously aren't connected to their early adversity. So I'm just curious if any of your control groups would match sort of some of those same kinds of outputs that you see for children who you do know about their early
Yeah,
adversity.
it's a great question. I mean, and it's sort of like, drilling down a little bit, the idea that, or that, that some of those early slides that I showed where what we're talking about is effects on particular systems, brain systems or biological systems that seem to be associated with early experiences, you're absolutely right. Those same kinds of phenomena can occur in the absence of some of those experiences. So what does that mean in terms of how should we proceed? What kinds of things should we do? This is, I think, only a partial answer, but one of the things that holds true across the board is that these systems are developing over time, regardless of what the adverse experience or not has been, and do, as a result, show the same kinds of plasticity over time because they're changing. And so the same kinds of strategies that can be effective for children who've experienced a lot of early adversity can be equally effective even if you don't have that set of experiences. And I think, again, that's part of where people get hung up. It's like, well, wait a minute, what I'm seeing here can't be the result of nurture because the environment's been great from the start, and so what do I do then? Because I can't say, oh, it's because of early neglect. But the same kinds of things around how do you promote serve and return, and also how do you learn to get the support that you need and to deal with some of those really challenging behaviors when kids have poor executive functioning. The same rules apply, and I think that a big part of the challenge is how do you prevent things from disrupting the serve and return process in your natural kind of parenting environment. So I think you're right. It's not always the adverse experience that creates that, but I would say that our research shows and clinical experience shows that still the tools that are available can be very effective. And the biggest issue is that regardless of the background of the child, that keeping those tools in place, sustained, even once you acquire them over the long run, is a tremendously challenging task, whether you're a foster parent or an adoptive parent trying to provide support to an individual in that context. It's the long-term nature of that and the extra effort that is always required that makes a difference. Yeah.
The cortisol data was quite interesting. I'm having a hard time reading that, though. I thought that cortisol was connected with a lowered immune system and slower healing and this kind of thing. And I would have thought that a lower cortisol level would have actually been beneficial. I'm just kind of trying to figure out how to read that lower cortisol level and what effects that might have.
So the issue is less, it turns out, about the kind of the absolute level than about the ability of the system to respond effectively to environmental challenges. And what we typically, whether cortisol levels are consistently high or consistently low, the fact that they seem to be out of tune with either the natural rhythms of daily life, as in the low circadian rhythm, or they're not showing an indication of response when there's a stress, suggests that they're really not doing their job. So if I think rather than think about cortisol as as something that's sort of an activator, one of the nicest ways I think to think about it, people talk about like homeostatic balance, or the extent to which it can return your body to a state that's not perturbed. And I think what we're seeing in these dysregulated systems is that the ability of your body to help you adjust to changes in the environment day to day becomes more compromised. Is that helpful?
So my question is, I'm a mom of 5 adopted kids and a clinician. I'm over here.
There you are, thank you. Good, if I look like I'm looking around, because the sound comes there, so please do, if I'm not looking at you, please wave.
Okay,
Yeah.
so mom of 5 kids that are adopted with big trauma histories and a clinician. And being familiar a bit with Dan Siegel's work, interpersonal neurobiology, your term of serve and return, is that similar to attunement and in concept? And the other question I have is, are you looking at the serve and return over the developmental process of kids? My kids are now, youngest 19. Is this still an effective intervention?
Yeah. Well, yes, the serve and return concept was developed as a way of distilling tremendous amounts of research in child development, developmental psychology, and it goes by many other names. So attunement, synchrony, there's a lot of language in attachment theory that applies to this. It turns out there's a lot of language in social learning about contingent responding that also applies. And part of the idea was, what are the commonalities across all of what's been being done by different researchers who have made up various useful names for these things that we can describe that really will help to facilitate people grasping the concept. And so it is very analogous. There might be slight nuances in the specifics, but I think we're talking about a basic process that many people have observed and thought of from many perspectives. So that's question number one. Question number two about, does it continue to apply? I think it very much does. And the idea, one of the central ideas behind it is that the serve is initiated by the child. So we're not talking about any interaction that occurs in a family context, and it could be started by the parent. That those instances happen a lot, but the things that are developmentally supportive around the child's healthy brain function have to do with instances where the child initiates something and the caregiver responds. We've been kind of moving slowly up the developmental ladder, so it's pretty easy to see serving and returning in preschool age children, and we're moving towards more and more towards kindergarten. But certainly that idea of children's or adolescents' bid for attention, their efforts to get a response, how the caregiver responds, continues to be salient through adulthood and probably in adult relationships, not just parent-child relationships. So yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, hello.
Hi. I'm also a social worker and a parent by adoption to two wonderful young people who it's really nice to hear it identified that the family setting is the therapeutic milieu, because a lot of trainings that I go to say, parents aren't professionals, we need to educate them. And what I so often hear is that the education is that if you're adopting, you should expect less from your children. You should expect worse behavior, and you should lower your own expectations, and that doesn't give you much to work with. I think going into it as a parent, I expected it to be very hard for the kids, but I also expected that somebody would be able to give advice on how to help them and what services to access. And it took a while to find somebody who really helped. Tagging on the last remark about your kids being 19 and over, when a kid comes to a family carrying over a decade of experience in the foster care system, and they may be formalizing adoption or even initiating the process over the age of 18, you can't really lug that kid in for sessions or tell him this nice fellow is going to videotape us. And I'm wondering, do you have any of this material available that could be used for parents who can't participate personally with their children in the videotaping? And also, is there any education component that would be appropriate for young adults themselves in the process? Because I think some of the education, particularly for older kids, coming into an adoption has to be, don't expect it to feel wonderful all at once. Don't be scared if it feels really bad for a while before it gets better. It's important for the kid not to give up on the process too.
Yeah. Yeah. So in response to the first part of what you were asking, I think the best context that I've seen for the situation that you describe, where maybe the parent is not in a position to be videotaped or to bring the child in, is the group approach that I talked about that's being done in England called the Adoptive program. And I think that it's not specific to that program, but just the idea that a weekly support group that provides parents with effective tools and support is really critical. And one of the things that speaks to some of the things you said at the beginning of your comment is that those groups in England are co-facilitated by 2 leaders, and one of them, by condition, has to be an adoptive parent themselves. So I think that helps to get past the, let me as the professional tell you as the adoptive parent what to expect, because people have been on, the group leaders have been on both sides of this as both professionals and as parents. And I think that does bring a kind of a fundamental difference to the group and kind of helps people feel like there's understanding there. I do not know about programs for young adults. If other people do, it would be interesting to hear about, but I think it's a good point that that's another area that would be really useful to address. Yeah.
Hello, I'm an adoptive parent, and I have about 4,000 questions.
Uh-oh.
But I've narrowed it.
Keep it to 3,500 or so.
Okay. I'll narrow it to one. If in the serve and return, the child is the one who serves initially, what if the serves are usually or often negative? How do you return a negative serve? What do you do in that?
Tell me, can you give an example of a negative serve?
No.
Huh? Wait, was no, you can't give a response, or was that the serve?
That was the serve. Constant oppositional, yeah.
Right. Okay, so I have 2 answers to that. One is that one of the wonderful things about this video approach, and at this point all I'd expect is that maybe you'd give me the benefit of the doubt on it because I've looked at a ton of videos, is that the things that children do around that are like what you're talking about are by far the most salient things to us. We're probably evolutionarily, programmed to notice the no's in the world because they're the things that, we can't pass on our genes if we're not noticing the negative stuff. So I think that's true. When we look at video as closely as we're able to and start and stop it, it turns out that even with children who the predominant response is negative, there are some positive serves. So again, you'll have to just take my word for it at this point, or not, and say, nah, but you can find them. And they're not as infrequent as you might think. So that's one part of the answer. The other part is, I said right towards the end of when I was talking about the video coaching, that it's not necessarily, it can just stand alone as an approach, but it can also be used in a way that's complementary to other approaches. And one of the things that's really important with children who have a lot of negative attention seeking and have developed a big repertoire of ways to not go along with things is to also have effective tools for dealing with that so that you're not constantly engaged in battles with them. And so I think in those kind of situations, it's not going to be enough, to just focus on the serve and return. You also need some effective things for doing other stuff. But it's really the combination of the two. So if you could see, oh, look, he did serve, and I did return the serve in that instance. I just need to look for more of those serves. And for you as an adoptive parent, it might not be, you may be all ready to return, but it's noticing the good serves that can really be transformative, where that video could be helpful. Plus, having support and effective ways of dealing with all of the negative behavior, of which there can be a vast amount. Okay? Yeah.
Oh, hello. This is a follow-up on the adolescent population. This work that you're doing is really fascinating, and the return and serve. The return and serve is very exciting for the younger kids. But as someone that is at the cutting edge of research in this area, are there other strategies to work with an aging population?
So as
Mm-hmm.
right, so as children get older and kind of need more effective skills and support and maybe struggling socially and starting to take some risks and things like that, then what kinds of stuff do you do? There are, I mean, I think if we had had more time and we could have delved into some of the things that we focus on in the Adopt program, that group approach that I was talking about, I think there are a lot of things that can be used effectively that are, you know, really well road tested around dealing with all kinds of children with challenging behaviors, with difficult behaviors. So I definitely think that there are approaches out there, and I think a lot of them, even though it's kind of an adaptation of the serve and return idea, have to do with not just dealing with the negative behavior and the high risk stuff, which I think is a huge challenge in and of itself, but also with noticing the positive and ways to help promote what can be a very limited set of positive skills on the part of the child. So yeah, the tools are out there, and I think both having them and having the support in an ongoing way that's needed to be able to stick with it are really the two most important things. Yeah, and I can give you more details afterwards.
Hi, I'm a psychologist, and I'm just curious a little bit about more of the trauma work with children themselves, and just models that I've been exposed to have been more focused on single trauma events as opposed to chronic trauma events that seem to be more predominant for children who have been through foster care or longer abuse or neglect situations. And then as well, children who have been adopted who don't know about their trauma experience. Maybe they were so early on, maybe in the first year of life. And sort of how do you address those situations for adopted children?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think, you know, you said at the beginning of your question that a lot of the approaches for trauma that have been developed in the psychotherapy landscape are to help deal with a single circumscribed trauma at a point where the person probably was able to at least have some sense of what was going on. And the context that we're dealing with is one where there may be many traumas, but they're not necessarily separable, nor have they necessarily occurred at a point where a child could make sense of what was happening. And I think that becomes a big challenge, is how do you sort of rethink the nature of what the individual's experience has been, and not throw trauma out as an experience that the child has had, but also not just look for a way to apply a trauma treatment model to this particular population. And it's actually, to me, where the kind of adversity lens becomes really useful, because I think what we're talking about is the kinds of ways that children are affected by more of the chronic instability that may be punctuated by episodes of trauma has to do with becoming very dysregulated and having poor executive functioning. And so in that context, providing the support around things like serve and return, and as children get older, just the structure and kind of skill development can really make a difference. And my experience is that, I mean, as a clinician myself, that in that context, if that structure is provided and you're creating the opportunity for the child to have kind of optimal development, that there may be bits and pieces of traumatic experience that come up from time to time and that can be addressed in sort of the traditional psychotherapeutic ways. I think the challenge that we get into is when we prioritize, this child comes from a background where there's been a lot of trauma, so let's kind of excise the traumatic experiences first before we do anything else, which I think just, especially when you're talking about a vulnerable and fragile, new family situation, or the child's in foster care, can really upset the apple cart. So I think the strategies that are used for trauma treatment can be useful, but I think they often get prioritized ahead of the kinds of, healthy, environmental, like nurturing development stuff that's needed to get the child on track. And once those things are in place, then I think a lot will take care of itself. Yeah, and I would say I'm a big believer that the right context can really set things on the right course, and that the idea that it's a system that has to be fixed externally is not necessarily the case. So often what we're talking about is if we put the right conditions in place, that a lot of things will move. And then our role as clinicians is to facilitate that, as opposed to take the child away and fix them and put them back. Okay, I saw a sign that said 2 minutes about a minute ago, so we have time for one more quick question.
Hi, I'm Ariel Friedman. I work as a research assistant in Dr. Goldberg's lab at Clark. One theme that I've noticed among families in our lab is a frustration with schools, that there's a disconnect and there's not enough education. For example, teachers are labeling certain actions as diligence, whereas a parent is noticing that it's more of a response to corporal punishment in orphanages before they had the child.
Yeah.
Do you think that something like fined is something that could be implemented with educators in schools?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's one of the our interests in developing it was to have it be very flexible in the platforms that it could fit within. But I also would say, just relating to, if you remember the lack of response to the frowny face data that we showed, that I think you're right, that often in contexts where people may not be as familiar with the individual or with the experience of individuals, that they may make interpretations of challenging behavior that may be totally disconnected from what's going on, and lead them to act in ways that are potentially not supportive of the child's development. So I think that education contexts are ones where it's really important for people to have a better sense of what is going on following adversity. And there seems to be there are some nice models where there's been training on adverse childhood experiences in school contexts that have really led to changes in how people orient to kids who come from difficult backgrounds. So yeah, good question. Okay, well, I think we're out of time, but thank you. Those were great questions, and I really enjoyed presenting and the discussion.